If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what is the most paranormal thing you have ever experienced? House sitting and taking care of the dogs for my aunt. It was an old farmhouse. Old as in the kitchen and bathroom were added on to the house when working plumbing became a common thing. I played some video games, watched a little TV, just winding down to go to sleep. Just laying there in the dark starting to doze off, and I hear something. Something coming from upstairs. The upstairs was an attic turned into bedrooms for my cousins. The best way I could describe it was like a pipe or a bottle, the sound of some kind of hollow object rolling back and forth across the floor in the room directly above me. I just sat there wide-eyed and scared crapless. Finally, I worked up the courage to get up and turn the lights back on. The rolling sound continued. I told myself it was just something in the walls, trying to come up with any rational explanation. I got up to turn the TV back on and just kinda drown out the sound. With the lights on, I noticed the dogs, two big Rottweilers, were sitting silently in the kitchen, hair bristling and staring right at me. I backed away, honestly afraid they were going to attack me for some reason, but I realized they weren't staring at me. They were looking past me at the door that goes upstairs. Well, crap. That did nothing to settle my nerves, but there was no way in hell I was going up to investigate. I cranked up the TV, eventually coaxed the dogs into the living room, and after a while I was tired again. I left the TV on, just turned it down, laid back down on the couch and got some shut-eye. I don't know how long I was asleep, just that when I woke up it was still pitch black outside. What woke me up was the door. My feet were hanging over the arm of the couch I was sleeping on, and the door that led upstairs had come open and hit my feet. If you've ever lived in an old house, you will know this kind of door. It's an old door. The kind that's been warped from too many winters and rubs the frame when you shut it. The kind you would have to put your shoulder into to close it all the way and would have to really pull to open it again. Yet there it was, wide open to a pitch black staircase, the hinges creaking as it bumped against my dangling feet. I was up and out in seconds, the dogs right behind me. Put my shoes on in the car, put the dogs in their kennel, and was off to sweet, sweet civilization. I wasn't spending another night in that house. I spent the days there, just slept at my house. Dogs were fine. I should preface this by saying it was, by far, the scariest experience of my life. Basically, on the hill above the city I live, there are a string of rather large defensive forts. My grandfather was the curator and lead tour guide of one of these forts. They date back to Napoleonic times, when the British were afraid of a French attack on the city, because of its importance to supplies and the navy. They're not incredibly creepy places, maybe that's because I'd spend every weekend roaming the tunnels or doing errands there, but this one event left me shocked and incapable of going back down there alone, even 12 years later. As I mentioned, under the forts are a network of tunnels that descend, in places, up to 100 feet below the chalk. Some of them are to access the defensive trenches that form the fort's outer boundary, some of them contain gun emplacements. All of them are gently sloping, hewn from rough chalk and lit dimly by the only kind of lights that work so far underground, those dim mining ones that rely on the weakest electrical current. All of the tunnels were familiar for me, they could all be accessed from a radial hub that was right in the depths of the fort, except for one. I had always been forbidden to walk down it. The tunnel was of rougher construction than the rest, unlit, and never used. Other than that, from the top end, it was fairly unassuming, just something I was never allowed to see. That was until I pestered my grandfather so much he decided to show me it. He grabbed a torch and we started down the tunnel. Immediately I regretted my decision. I wish I had photographs of it, but the smooth chalk walls I was used to in the other tunnels were replaced with this jagged texture that threatened to draw blood if you scraped them with an unlucky limb. My grandfather, curiously, was aiming the torch beam at the left wall of the tunnel, searching for something. He found it, perhaps halfway down. There, inscribed in the chalk, was a rough cross and a date that was nigh illegible. "This is why you're not supposed to come down here," he said. "This tunnel was supposed to be condemned. Someone was crushed right here." A chill ran through me and I asked to leave. My grandfather chuckled and carried on, saying that there was nothing to worry about. I started to get a bad feeling from then on, as if someone was following us. Eventually we reached the bottom, a fairly regular gun emplacement met us. Then we turned to leave. The nature of the tunnels meant you could see all the way up to the other end, where a door-shaped piece of light meant the security of the radial hub. What me and my grandfather saw chills my bones and, like I said, means I can't go down there anymore. We were 100% sure we were the only people there, It was out of hours, and my grandfather always locked the main gate behind us when we entered the tunnel system to stop people trespassing and stealing the cannons or old munitions. I swear too, we saw the silhouette of a man slowly walk across the top of the tunnel, turn to face down to us, and then carry on. My grandfather is a brave man, but he looked visibly aggrieved. What was worse, we knew we had to run up the tunnel to get out, or be stuck in a 100-foot trench in the middle of winter. We had to pass the cross of that crushed tunnel worker. I'll end my story here. Obviously I made it out alive, but when someone tells me they don't believe in ghosts, I tell them this story. When I was around 13, we had a huge German Shepherd who was 7 at the time. This dog was a beast. He wasn't afraid of anything. Ever. Constantly following me to school and waiting for me to come home at the foot of our driveway. All around a great dog. Again, let me re-emphasize, this dog wasn't afraid of anything. Anyway, we bought this house we were living in at the time for super cheap because the previous owner had hung himself in the downstairs coat closet and it wasn't selling fast enough. One day, I walked down the stairs to see my dog staring at the closet. Just staring. He was standing up, tail between his legs, not moving an inch, just staring at it. The door was open, which was weird, because people in my house are usually good about closing things up. I go over to Rodney, my dog, and try and see if there is something in the closet from where he is looking. Can't see anything, but the closet is super dark. I try and snap Rodney out of it, but he won't budge. He just keeps staring and staring. I had never seen my dog like this. The most horrifying part, Rodney's head is moving slightly from left to right, like he is following the movement of something hanging in the closet. When I was in about the 6th grade, a friend and I went to another girl's house, which was in the country, a few days before Halloween. We wanted spooky things to happen, so we did the typical preteen girl creepy slumber party activities, like playing with the Ouija board and doing Bloody Mary. The next evening, the girl who lived there told us she heard of a crazy lady who lived nearby, and threw plates at people. We decided to take their golf cart and try to find her, and videotape her throwing plates at us. We didn't. We got lost in woods instead. All of a sudden, I saw something, or someone, floating in the distance. My friend turned on the video camera and we got out of the golf cart to creep closer. We were scared, but curious at this point. "It's a person," I remember whispering, when we were close. "He's dead." "No, it's just a Halloween decoration." My friend insisted. It wasn't a Halloween decoration. It was a dead body, hanging from a tree. At first we thought he was murdered, then put up on display. We were freaking out. The concept of suicide was not well formed in our heads. But the knocked over ladder and the note tacked to the tree, which we didn't read, proved otherwise. My friend called the cops. When they arrived we were told to leave immediately. I remember tons of police cars and at least ambulance arrived. They made us turn off the video camera, which had been rolling the whole time, and call her mom, to get us back to the house. The parents tried to convince us, as we sat in the kitchen crying, that it was simply a Halloween decoration. But police don't send kids home if it isn't a dead body. Every year before Halloween I have nightmares sparked by this event. I'm on a hill in the dark. There are dead trees surrounding me, with a dead body hanging from each one. I was never a believer in ghosts/spirits, the paranormal, UFOs and stuff. About 2 years ago me and Buddy decided to go on a drive. It was a hot summer's night and we were bored out of our minds, so we picked up some cigarettes and went on a late night drive. We decided to drive to the top of the mountain. The base of the mountain is about an hour's drive from where I lived and it takes about another hour to drive all the way to the top where they have a restaurant/bar. This is in Norway, by the way. It was pretty late, around 3 a.m. in morning. We knew the bar would be closed but we thought we would just chill on the benches, have a smoke and take in the view at first light. So, we get to the base of the mountain and start driving up and round. The road twists round the mountain until you get to the top, so when you reach a turn you can barely see round the corner. It was pitch black darkness, only the road was visible due to the street lights, but apart from the road, the edges and mountainside were barely visible. We had been driving for about half an hour. Everything was pretty enjoyable, absolutely empty roads. Guess all the sane ones were asleep in bed ready to wake up and go to work in the morning. Complete silence, it was just relaxing. As we turn one of the bends, I get this very uneasy feeling as I see something, definitely a person, sitting on a boulder at the edge of the road. My friend sees this as well, but keeps driving, and I'm thinking, WTF bro, but I realize that he is turning the car round and going back because it's pretty treacherous to reverse on that road. So we head back, slowly, and I realize that he is fine. He's not getting any bad feelings, he is in his normal mood. So I convinced myself that I'm acting weird and that it's probably just some crazy hiker. We park the car right opposite this figure, engine still running, and my friend calls out, "Hi there, are you okay?" I have to admit I was still pretty scared, so I didn't say anything. No response. The figure then looks up in our direction and we get the ducking crap scared out of us. We saw that it was a woman, wearing a plain white dress, with very long, beautiful hair, but her face was 3 times the length of a normal person's face, her eyes were completely blank and she had a smile on her face. I swear to God we both felt so fearful that we were completely paralyzed. We couldn't yell, or even communicate, not even a single word, it felt like we couldn't move. I don't know how he found the courage to press the gas and get the hell out of there. But I do remember that when we both got home we had a very high fever and we were like that for a couple more days afterwards. I grew up in the Arctic. In the town I lived in, as long as it was a clear night, it was an extremely normal occurrence to see all sorts of strange lights move across the sky. Keep in mind the winter is long in the Arctic, which means longer amounts of time being spent under the stars. It's quite beautiful, as long as you don't mind the cold so much. Sometimes I would drive a snowmobile a few kilometers out of town, shut it down, and just lay down on the snow looking up at the majesty of it all, the only thing disturbing the silence being the occasional breeze. The northern lights are also a common occurrence. Doesn't happen every day, but often enough that they start getting ignored after a while, as long as they aren't too spectacular anyway. On one particular night, without asking my parents, it was their snowmobile, I decided to go on one of my midnight drives out of town. I drove a few kilometers over the hills to find a spot devoid of light pollution from town, shut off the machine, and settled into a good spot to look up and be retrospective. It wasn't all that interesting a scene. A few satellites passing here and there, some relatively boring activity affecting the magnetic field, etc., and then I started noticing a clicking noise. At first I thought it was the sound of the snow machine cooling down, as engine expands and contracts a lot in the cold. But the source of the sound definitely wasn't coming from that direction. My next thought was there must be an animal nearby, in which case I need to get out of there fast. You don't really want to mess with a wild animal. But, the clicking is far too regular for an animal to produce it. It was fairly mechanical sounding. And again, the source of the sound isn't coming from anywhere around me laterally. It was coming from up. So naturally I look up, determined to ascertain the origin of this strange noise. I see what I always see, stars, northern lights, a lazy satellite crossing the sky, all normal stuff. But before I dismiss it altogether and begin heading home, I notice something strange in the aurora borealis. There were 3 rather strong points of light. I ignored them at first, thinking they were oddly symmetrical stars, but this proved false. They were definitely getting brighter. I kept staring in morbid fascination as they grew stronger and stronger, yet still only remaining single points in the sky. All the while the clicking noise is getting louder and louder and more pronounced, almost like someone started with tapping a pen on a desk to clacking BR balls together inside my head. Then it stops. The lights are gone, the clicking is not heard, and aside from being a little stiff, cold, and rather petrified, I'm fine. So I jump back on the snowmobile thinking maybe I'm going crazy. The machine takes a little longer than usual to start up, and I'm beginning to worry, but soon it's running and I'm heading back to town. As I'm driving back, several plausible scenarios as to what occurred are running through my head. I'm thinking it could have been a helicopter from the mine, or some strange northern lights behavior, etc. Probably not that big a deal. I get pull up to my house. Lights are all dark. Strange. It wasn't that late when I left. Open outer door as quietly as possible, remove winter gear, enter inner door. House is quiet. Really quiet. My parents are teachers and are usually up late marking or watching TV. All I'm thinking is I have to get to bed without anyone noticing. Proves to be easy as I'm soon under my covers. I go to set my alarm for the next day. All of the sudden everything makes sense. Engine hard to start, stiff, rather chilly, nobody up when I was gone what felt like relatively short period of time. It was almost 11 p.m. when I left, and now it was creeping up on 6 a.m. I stood, staring at clicking lights for almost 7 hours. I never ended up sleeping that night, and I don't go on late night snow machine rides anymore. I work in a nursing home, so we have weird things happen all the time. Socks traveling across the hall by themselves, cupboards opening and stuff flying out, lights turning off and on, washing machines just sitting all full of ice water for no reason, etc. But our Alzheimer unit has the most activity. All of our Alzheimer rooms have special sensors, so we know if a resident is getting out of bed or leaving their room. It is to assure we know where they are and that they don't fall. One particular night a call light kept going off promptly, followed by that room's bathroom sensor being tripped. This room's resident had passed away 3 days before and we didn't have anyone else in there yet. We turned it off about 4 times in 3 hours and were pretty creeped. Then, at 10 p.m., just an hour before I got to leave, we heard a lady screaming for help. We ran back to the source and it turned out to be in that same room. The bathroom sensors started going off again right when we got there. We had to check in case some other resident had gone in, but there was no one. The sink and shower were both running full blast with ice cold water though. I turned everything off and reset the switch, and gently pulled the door closed as I left. Halfway through closing it, someone/thing slammed it closed for me. I almost had my shoe caught. I refused to go back in the rest of the night. When I was about 11, I went through this really bizarre period in my life where I was exhausted all the time because I had started having really vivid, involved dreams, so it felt like I never slept. The dreams were linear, and I was the star of them, but I was someone else, a girl named Cheryl who was 16 years old, living in Texas in the 80s. There was nothing weird about the dreams in general, it was just that, for the entire time I was asleep, I was another person in a different body with a different family, doing perfectly ordinary things. And the dreams always started out the same way. I would go to sleep as me, and wake up as Cheryl, but not really Cheryl. I knew I wasn't her, but couldn't convince anyone else I wasn't. I would go eat breakfast with her family, go to school, take her classes, talk to her friends, and then go back to sleep in her bed and wake up as me again. This lasted for months, started off slowly, maybe 1 or 2 dreams a week, until finally they were every single night. In the real world, I started falling asleep in classes, had an overabundance of migraines, prone to them anyway, was constantly anemic and just generally sickly. Nothing super awful happened in the dreams, except for the pressure of taking high school classes with stuff I'd never learned before, because I was actually 11, and trying to pass courses based on material that was way above my age range. Also, trying to fit in with her family and friends, because I was still me, just in her body. I didn't actually recognize them or remember them or are supposed in jokes/family history. I could pass it all off as just stress and say it was totally unremarkable if it weren't for the fact that I actually did learn crap from the classes I took at her high school, stuff that I couldn't have known, hadn't studied, and wouldn't learn until I was in high school myself. Like most kids growing up in Hawaii, I was warned early to never take raw pork over the pali. The pali is the mountain range that separates the north side of the island from the south side, and it is where legend has it the demigod Pua'a, pig, lived. Bringing pork over the pali would enrage the demigod and he would prevent you from traveling. In high school, 2 friends and I foolishly decided to see whether or not this legend was true. Near midnight, the 3 of us packed into Paul's Toyota Tercel with a package of raw pork. There's nothing in the legend about a specific time, but we figured midnight had a good, spooky feel to it. The thick foliage blocked most of the moonlight and the road did not have any street lights. The night seemed especially dark. We acted brave and cool by cracking jokes about the pig god and how if we were stopped we'd kick the crap out of whatever stopped us, demigod notwithstanding. Near the top of the pali the engine cut out. The headlights were still shining bright but the car just coasted to a stop. After a few seconds of absolute quiet, Tom and I started cursing Paul, telling him to cut this crap out and start the ducking car. Paul seemed more panicked than us as he tried turning the engine over to no avail. Tom, who was alone in the back seat, tried crawling into the front of the car all the while Paul kept trying to start the engine. "Throw out the pork," I yelled, and Tom grabbed it from the back seat. I was too afraid to open the window and didn't want to look outside. Paul wound down his window down a crack and after a couple attempts Tom managed to squeeze the package out of the 2 or 3 inches Paul had the window down. As soon as the package left the car, Paul started the engine and we sped down the pali back to town, the 3 of us sitting in the cramped front of the Tercel. The entire ride back no one spoke. The next morning, casually over breakfast, I mentioned to my mother what we had done. Before I could tell her what had happened, she became very upset, more so than I had ever seen her. She told me how stupid we were and that under no circumstances were we to ever attempt to do something like that again. She explained to me that many years before, while she worked at the bank, 2 holy guys who also worked at the bank were bragging that they were going to the pali with pork. A week later, when they came back to work, both their heads of hair had turned completely white. They refused to talk about what had happened and they left the bank shortly thereafter. There may be many explanations for what happened. The Tercel was old. Typical engine problems. Overactive imagination. I did return a few days later in broad daylight to bring flowers and to apologize and pay my respects. Would I try to do this again? Absolutely not. Even if you're a non-believer, there is something to be said for respecting other people's beliefs and respecting their culture. The most paranormal thing I've experienced was probably the time when a friend of mine and my brother tried to communicate with ghosts. Me and my friend were having a drink downstairs and I came out of the kitchen and turned to the light that was shining outside, and after I sat down he said that the light just blinked, and after a couple of minutes we decided we should try to make contact with ghosts to see if there are any in my house. At this point my grandfather, 3 years dead, at that time, and my dog, less than a year, were the only things I knew of that died nearby. So after we made the Ouija board, my brother came downstairs and joined us. We decided that we were going to give it around 3 tries. The first time nothing really happened except for a little bit of moving of the glass, but that could have been easily one of us. The second try went basically the same, but my brother felt some chills down his spine and I thought that I saw a weird kind of mist walking past the couch he was sitting on. On the third time, we didn't something would happen since nothing really happened the first 2 times, but as soon as we wanted to leave, we heard an extremely loud bang from the side. At that time I thought the fucking wall collapsed or something in that nature. But it scared the living crap out of everyone. After that happened, my brother quickly turned on the light and we saw what happened. A portrait of my dog was ripped of the wall. On a side note, it was impossible to get that off with bare hands even. After that we rushed upstairs and tried to sleep. I didn't have so much trouble with it because if it's my dog that would be awesome, but I've heard other things in the house as well which makes me consider it. That was my story. This is a good one and it still gives me the chills. When I was little I grew up right on the edge on the woods in Missouri. Where we liked to hike there was a sudden and deep ravine into a creek. We were always really careful because bones could easily be broken if you fell or slipped off the edge. Well, one day I was on my porch and I'd quiet, but I turned around and at the edge of the woods there was a little girl standing there and she looked just like my little sister but way paler and she had old gray sweats and a gray sweater on. So I yelled, "Julie? What are you doing in the woods?" And the little girl turned and started running straight towards the ravine. Naturally I freaked out and started yelling, "Stop. Julie, stop." My mom came outside to see what was wrong and I was panicking, crying and yelling that she had just ran towards the ravine and fell off. My mom looked at me like I was crazy and said, "Julie is upstairs watching cartoons." I ran over to the ravine and no one was there. To make things even worse, I was hiking with my brother one day and we decided to go deeper into the woods than ever before. Well, we did, and we found an old burned down house. Outside there was a little girl's rusted tricycle. I will never forget her face. My uncle and aunt decided to leave the UK in the early 90s. They bought a shell of a farmhouse in very rural Umbria, Italy, and moved there with their 3 young children. They basically camped in this house and very slowly made it habitable. Very quickly strange things started happening. Pots and pans jumped off the hooks on the walls in the kitchen. My cousins woke up but were paralyzed in their beds and felt a presence holding them down. My uncle woke in the night cold and saw his bed sheet being dropped in the corner or the room as if it had been picked up by an invisible hand. One day my cousins were playing in the old tobacco tower in the garden and heard someone call them from outside. Just as they ran outside, the roof collapsed, and there was no one there calling them. This near-fatal accident was the last straw and they asked people in the local town for advice. None of my family are religious, but Italy is very Catholic and their only option seemed to be to hire a priest to do an exorcism. He came and did his stuff, said prayers and scattered holy water, etc. The strange occurrences seemed to cease and they got back to working on the house without having to fear for their safety. My uncle was stripping back a wall to replaster it and found a strange hollow inside the wall. He pulled away the rest of the plaster and found a small, crudely made doll inside. Ducking creepy crap. My aunt had been told about an old lady in the town who was rumored to dabble in the paranormal, so she took the doll to show her. The lady was seriously spooked and told my aunt that they had to send the doll away, quickly. The best thing to do was to build a small boat and let the doll wash away down the river, once you had wished it a safe journey. My aunt and uncle still can't believe all this happened, and it's been nearly 20 years since. They did as the lady said and have never had any trouble since. They think it was a poltergeist and the doll was some sort of curse that had been put on the house. Years later they found out that the name of the house, La Buia, is Old Italian for the darkness. Finding that out was enough to convince us all that these old hippies probably hadn't just been sitting on their Umbrian hillside drinking too much wine. So, me and my best friend, including 3 others, were hanging out in this field about midnight to 1 in the morning. You can only access this field with an off-roading vehicle. Our 3 other friends wandered off. I should mention only one of them is a girl. So me and my best friend were walking by ourselves and we came across this girl, wearing a white t-shirt, with her back to us. We thought it's our friend, since there are no other cars up there. So we called her name. She didn't move. We got closer and called again. We got probably 5 feet behind her and called again. She didn't move. We got freaked and headed back to the car, found the girl who we thought it was, and she wasn't wearing a white t-shirt. We thought it was a prank at first, but we realized it couldn't have been her for many reasons. We still don't know who/what she was. The scariest part was that she was near some government building or something. No one knows what it is because on Google Earth it's surrounded by trees. My best friend tried to go there and some guys in a car drove up and told him not to come back or he would get shot. It happened in college, conveniently right near Halloween. My friends at the time were quite diverse in our religious beliefs, and it being All Hallows Eve, my Wicca friend wanted to show us all his beliefs. I enjoy the paranormal, I always have. As a man of science, I enjoy trying to explain the explainable. Mostly I enjoy the psychology of it, watching out brains trying to piece together things it wants to believe. The subconscious grasping at fragments of reality resulting in a psychosomatic hallucination. He said he wanted to try to summon something. He said to trust him, and trying to remain skeptical, we indulged his request. He lit candles and turned off the lights as we formed a circle around candles. We sat down and held hands as my friend bowed his head and began humming. He kept humming his Om as we all closed our eyes. Suddenly an image of a cottage appeared in my head. It was surreal and so clear. I could feel myself there. I was in a calm grass field. I was standing just at the forest edge when I slowly walked up the path to the cottage. It had 2 floors and was a natural wooden brown. I looked over and saw the window near the door was shattered, when suddenly, my girlfriend at the time screamed. She got up and ran out of the room. Another one of my friends jolted back and yelled, "Oh God, what did I see?" He then starts frantically talking about how he saw himself as a wolf. He then starts talking about the details. He was in a field. He ran towards a house. It was what I saw, everything. It wasn't just some vague details, but everything, from the field to the colors. Everything. I asked about the windows because I remember one was broken. He said he saw himself jumping through it. We stared at each other and knew. We saw the same thing. We heard my girlfriend scream again and we run out of the room to check on her. She is cowering in a corner crying. She is hysterical and won't stop crying about her children. She doesn't have any children. She is in tears crying out for them, crying out for children she doesn't have. We try to calm her down but we can't. We ask her what happened when she says, "The dogs got them. They attacked them. Oh God, the blood." We stood there in silence, mouths agape at what we just heard. Oh God, what did we see? What did we see? I would love a scientific explanation for this, as I'm very skeptical of any paranormal occurrences, but I cannot explain this. I was walking through a graveyard with some friends in November, in the UK, and it was bitterly cold. We were alone in the yard, just reading the names and admiring the statues. I walked on ahead towards the children's section of the graveyard to see the stuffed animals and read the names. This was when Monsters Incorporated had been released, and at the time, cereal box prizes included a toy from the film. One toy which I had won was a dark purple Randall figure that went bright blue when warmed, warm water or breathing on it, etc. On a decorative crucifix marking one grave there was a Randall toy hanging from one of the arms. It was bright blue. Needless to say, I got out of that graveyard very quickly. Our hometown is where Buffalo Bill Cody's Scouts Rest Ranch is located. When my mom was in college, right around 1970, she had a summer job giving tours there. One night, her and the other tour guides thought it would be a good idea to stay in the main house after hours and use my mom's Ouija board. They all sat around the dining room table to summon the spirits that might still be there. She said that the planchette began to move around the Ouija board without any of them laying a finger on it. One of the questions they asked was who was there with them in the house. The planchette named Buffalo Bill's nanny, Buffalo Bill himself, and the Duke of Luxembourg. She won't tell me anything more of the story. She said it freaked her out, and she never played with the Ouija board since. Fast forward to when I was 11. I had found her Ouija board hidden in the walk-in closet cupboard in our den. At one point, I had lost the clear part of the planchette that holds the pin. The Ouija board wouldn't work after that. I always thought it was interesting that all the pieces of that Ouija board set had the name of William Fuld on it, and I've always thought losing that piece had something to do with it. When my mother found out that me and my friends were experimenting with it, she promptly threw it in the fireplace and burned it. It took place in Shikoku, Japan, in 2006. Shikoku is the smallest of the main islands, and it's also somewhat of a mysterious, spiritual place. Many Japanese people don't know anything about Shikoku or what goes on there. It's kind of like a forgotten place. My friend and I were doing a Buddhist pilgrimage around the island in the summer. The pilgrimage consists of walking about 1,000 miles and visiting 88 temples along the way. We were doing it in the summer and with almost no money. Both are unusual these days, but relevant to the story. Because it's the summer, we were hit with a few giant storms and a typhoon as we were walking. When it wasn't raining, it was baking hot. We were also traveling with no money, so we relied on the houses for pilgrims along the way. We asked every temple if they knew of a place where we could sleep for free, and usually they would just point us to a bus stop that had a bench and a roof or something equally disappointing. My friend and I arrive at the largest temple on the island and ask the monks if they know of a place where we can stay. The monks talk for a moment and then one goes to the back of the temple to get something. He brings back a key and draws a rough map on a piece of loose paper and tells us that there is a house nearby that's empty and we're allowed to sleep in it for the night. We take the key and the map and win through these narrow alleys and side streets lined with relatively new commercial buildings. We reach the house. It's completely hidden behind the commercial buildings, off an alleyway. It's a traditional style Japanese manor, too big for typical, middle-class workers. My friend and I feel a wave of dread sweep over us. I'm pretty skeptical and always strive to reason with myself. I'm a fan of introspection and cognitive therapy. I realize this dread makes no sense, so I start examining why I feel the way I do. I can't find a reason for the dread, so I blame it on a fear of the unknown. My friend and I enter the house and the dread follows us in. I figure the best way to get rid of it is to explore the house, room by room. My friend and I explore the first floor and it's entirely empty. We find a room with futons and decide that's where we'll sleep that night. The dread is still there. I want to go explore the rest of the house, up the stairs, but my friend refuses. He told me I can do it alone, but there's no way he's going up to the second floor. I go up alone and start looking into the rooms. The dread is worse than ever and every time I open a door, I get a weird mental flash of a woman standing there. It's like my brain is trying to predict what will be there, but every time the rooms are empty. I get a really strange feeling of being watched from all directions by a single person. My friend and I clean up from the 20 miles of trekking we covered that day and leave the house to find food. A woman calls us over and tells us that she knows we are pilgrims and she wants to feed us for free at her family's restaurant. That's something that happens occasionally when you're a pilgrim in Shikoku and it's appreciated. After dinner, we start to head back to the house. The clouds are dark and you can smell that pre-rain smell, if that makes sense. We're pretty glad to be under a roof tonight, but as soon as we get to the house, our merriment turns to dread again. We open the door to the house only to find that it's now absolutely wall-to-wall filled with cats. We were only gone for about 2 hours or so and there wasn't any evidence cats lived there when we did our initial inspection. There were no open windows, no other doors outside, no conceivable way for these cats to get in, especially in that number in that amount of time. I assumed there were holes and entrances to the house that I just didn't know about and left it at that. My friend and I make it over to our futon room and slide the rice paper panel doors shut. However those cats got in, they can leave the same way. The storm hits and rain starts pelting the house. My friend and I are exhausted from the pilgrimage and hit the sack like a ton of bricks. Then, something weird happens. We both wake up at about 2:30 a.m. for no reason. We're both still tired, but we have this sudden energy boost. The storm is over. The room is pretty stuffy from the post-storm humidity. I open the panel doors to let the air move through the house and notice that every single cat is gone. They all left, not one stayed. My friend and I are sleeping on opposite sides of the room, reading the books we brought with us until we're tired enough to fall back asleep. After about 15 minutes, we're sleepy again and I go to close the doors. I'm closing them in the traditional way, sitting on your knees and sliding the panel closed with one hand. As I close the second door, a long, thick lock of jet black hair falls directly into my lap, in front of my face. At the exact same time, across the room, the same thing happens to my friend, except his hair isn't black, it's white and gray, like from an old woman. We're not scared, we're just super confused. This looked and felt like human hair and it was thick enough that it couldn't have just been floating around. It was like someone had just ripped a chunk of hair out of someone's head. We sweep the hair into a corner and I go exploring for the source of this hair. I couldn't think of it as hair. At first, I had to think of it as bizarre, traditional Japanese insulation or something. I looked all over that room and the adjacent rooms, combing the walls and ceiling for a crack, hole, gap or anything that would explain where this stuff came from. Nothing. The carpentry was solid, almost airtight as evidenced by the poor air circulation in that room earlier. As Sherlock Holmes said, once you eliminate the impossible, whatever is left, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. So the only thing left would be that this hair was somehow stuck to the ceiling and my friend and I just didn't see it earlier. It became unstuck at the exact same moment without the aid of a breeze or any kind of air movement, and dropped into our laps. It's improbable, but it's the only rational explanation left. We move our futons to different corners of the room and sit down to read again to go back to sleep. The doors are closed. There is no movement in the room besides from our gently rocking bodies as we read. It happens again. I get the black hair, my friend gets the gray/white hair. At this point, we're so done with this goddamn house and its surprises. Annoyed, I brush the hair into the corner with the other hair and pull the blanket over my head. If any more weird crap is going to happen, it can happen on the blanket and not disturb my desperately needed sleep. In the morning, we're awoken by a pounding on our door. An old woman is knocking on the front door, telling us to leave the house. I don't know how she knew we were there or why she didn't want us there, but she was insistent. We sprung out of the futons, changed and got ready to go in about 2 minutes flat. We went back to the temple to return the key, but the monks weren't manning the temple office, so we dropped the key and map off with an offuta as thanks and left. It took us a few days to talk about that weird house again. I think we each thought we temporarily went crazy or had a really ducked up, super realistic dream. We were relieved when we finally talked and confirmed that that crap actually happened. Anyway, so I did some research about 2 or 3 years ago into what that stuff possibly could have been. I found nothing about Japanese hair insulation or building materials, so I decided to search for information on Japanese mythology instead. It turns out that the Japanese witching hour is between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., that's apparently when the spooky stuff comes out. The most common kind of ghost is called a yurei and it's a woman with long black hair, but she can be depicted with gray or white hair, too. That's the kind of ghost that was depicted in The Grudge and The Ring. My parents have a cabin on Lake Superior. It is situated such that a small marsh/swamp sits between the cabin and the lake/beach area. There is a small wood bridge that crosses the swamp/marsh. A couple times a year, I go up to the cabin on my own with my dog and we just hang out for a long weekend, go hiking, rock climbing, etc. It's a good way to de-stress from work. Last summer, we went up to the cabin and I spent most of the day on the beach part of the property reading Nikola Tesla's Colorado Springs notes with my puppy next to me, sleeping on the rocks enjoying the sun. Fast forward to later that night, I throw my dog's leash on him and take him for a walk just before bed as I usually do. If he isn't exhausted before I go to bed, he bugs me all night. As we cross the bridge over the swamp and get onto the beach, we run into an older gentleman walking down the beach towards us. I don't think much of it, because we have a ton of neighbors, most of whom are elderly. I just figure it's one of them out for a walk on our property NBD. As my dog and I get nearer, the man flags us down so we walk towards him. We exchange general pleasantries. Now at this point, I notice that my dog has taken absolutely no notice of the old man, which is odd, because he is the type of dog who instantly becomes best friends with anyone and everyone he meets, but I just shrug it off. Just before we continue our walk, the old man looks at me and says, "Perfect weather for seeing a will-o'-the-wisp, don't you think?" We are in Minnesota, so this is exactly how he said it. I agreed, not really sure how else to respond. We bade farewell and continued on our way down the beach, and ended up walking about 1 mile out, and then started making our way back. I then notice a small, greenish light floating on the beach right in the general vicinity of where we had run into the old man. Being a rational and intelligent person, I just assume it is still the old guy wandering around the beach and he is now carrying an LED light since it is now quite dark. As we make our way towards the light, I notice there is nothing else around it, at least that I can see. Finally, when we are within about 20 to 30 feet of it, it disappears, and I notice it was in almost the same spot as the old man was standing, and there is nothing else around. Needless to say, my dog and I hightailed it back to the cabin, and didn't venture out anymore that night. Can't really say it was necessarily paranormal, but it was rather odd and kinda freaked me out a bit. There is a hill that is said to be haunted, about a few hours drive into the bush near M-Town. I'll tell the tale than my own experience. Ages ago, there was a father who had brought home a puppy for his daughter, but the puppy ran away. The daughter went looking for it, but there was a huge snowstorm. The father went after the daughter with his lamp, and kept looking till he died. So, apparently the ghost of the father is still wandering, looking for his daughter. To see this ghost you're supposed to go to the hill, flash your lights 3 times and yell "Daddy" 3 times, and you're supposed to see a green light that is the father's lantern. So my experience was interesting. A few of my friends and I went there, did what was required and nothing had happened. We sat in front of the car for a good 10 minutes. Then I felt a chill, as well as burning all in my shoulders, but I kept calm. My friend who is a shaman in his native religion said, "Something is here. I don't think it's a ghost." The bush around us got really quiet, no wind, no animals. Then we heard something move in the bush in front of us. Some of my friends went into the car because they got scared, and the guys who were more serious about this, as well as I, stayed out. The moving sounds seemed to circulate around us. Then we heard walking sounds in front of the car. Buddy turned on the headlights of the car, nothing was there, but the walking sounds continued in front of us. It stopped, and we heard a landing sound behind the car, as if whatever was in front of us jumped. So we gathered around the back of the car and we heard moving sounds but coming from 2 different spots on the road. I was standing with my shaman friend and we both heard a growl come from between us, as well as a low-sounding exhale. The group of us decided to take a walk down to an unmarked graveyard that was nearby. As we went by, My shaman friend went in to examine what was left as a headstone, then continued exploring more down the path. Few of us stayed by the graveyard and chatted. I looked at the time, it was 3 a.m., and I mentioned how 3 a.m. is the hour of the dead. Right then we heard a loud crack come from a grave. We all jumped, of course, and we thought it was our friend who went off on his own, but he was far off in the opposite direction. We decided to head back to the hill where we parked the car. Once my shaman friend reunited, 3 of us started for another path. I felt a peace within this path. Then the path forked, and as we continued I got a gut feeling of danger. I felt sick, I couldn't breathe, and I was holding this guy's hand. I didn't notice I was squeezing it tightly until he had mentioned it. My shaman friend mentioned he had a bad feeling, so we headed back. Once we got back to the hill again, I regrouped with everyone else. My shaman and the guy I held hands with tried the ghost thing again, and apparently they saw the ghost's lamp. The rest of us were in the car parked away from the hill. They came back and told us it worked, so they brought the car over and tried again. Again, the 3 of us stood outside the car while everyone else was inside. We called, and waited. We heard footsteps walking back and forth in front of us. I felt anger come from it. We suspected it was the ghost. We could hear him walking, but he didn't have the lantern on because it knew we weren't his daughter. So, we left. Altogether, it was an interesting experience. There were definitely more beings there than the ghost from the story. My family and I used to live next to a private cemetery. It literally went our house driveway wire metal fence cemetery. So strange things happened at our house all the time. Thumpings coming from the attack. Footsteps down the hallway when no one else was at home. The creepiest thing that ever happened though was when I was 6. I was having problems sleeping that night, so I went to try and get some sleep one of the living room couches. My dad was sleeping on the other. Coincidentally, this room was the room closest to graveyard, and I hadn't thought of this beforehand, but I definitely would remember after. I still couldn't sleep, so I kept staring at the VCR clock. At exactly 1:26 a.m. in middle of living room, a man with a white ball cap, a blue t-shirt, and white pants just appeared. Out of nowhere. Now, I did what any 6-year-old girl would have done after seeing a person just appear. I screamed my lungs out. After that, the man disappeared into his ball cap, and then the cap melted away. My dad wasn't too happy I had woken him up. He hadn't seen anything, and soon after, I started therapy. To this day, I still get a bit unnerved when I think of the incident. I'm also very glad I no longer live in that house.